Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals. Hello and welcome to the Safer Chemicals Podcast. We will be talking about an EU-wide project where national authorities inspected nearly 6,000 products sold online in the EU and EEA. The project looked at different web shops and online marketplaces and whether they followed the rules set by EU chemicals legislation. The inspections covered both professional products such as lead used for welding and consumer goods like textiles, leather, toys, and jewellery. The project found that most of the inspected products did not comply with the law. We will be diving deeper into the findings and talking about what needs to change for the low level of compliance to improve. We will also hear some tips for anyone wanting to buy these products online and what steps can be taken to ensure the products meet legal requirements and can ultimately be used safely. With us are Karin Rumar, the chair of the working group for the project, and Maciej Baranski, who works in the Harmonised Enforcement Team here at the European Chemicals Agency. Thank you both for joining us. Let's start with you, Karin. Can you tell me what were the main drivers for doing the project in the first place, and why did you decide to focus specifically on online sales?
Yes, as we all know, this is really a growing market, especially in these pandemic times. And we also have many new actors and maybe also small actors that are not aware of the chemical legislation. And different member states has also seen high levels of non-compliance on online sales. And Forum had a pilot project in 2017, and there the non-compliance was around 83%. So therefore, we wanted to follow up this and also add some other requirements to this online sales project.
Okay, thanks. And what exactly did the inspections check for, and what were the main findings?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say that this very high level of non-compliance in this project is partly due to the risk-based approach. That means that inspectors, they are not doing random tests, instead spot checks to really find the non-compliances. So it's not a full picture of the market. And especially for some legislation, it's easy to already see the non-compliance on the web page. And that's why this high level of non-compliance. But another reason is also that there exists a high level of non-compliance, especially for some parts that we will talk about later. If we first look at the restriction parts of this project, which is the REACH restrictions, where products are restricted in limited, banned in different ways. We have also looked slightly at safety data sheets, which is a document that workers can use to get to know how to handle a product containing a harmful chemical and to handle it safely.
Okay, and what were the findings for the REACH obligation specifically?
So 78% of the inspected products did not comply with the REACH restrictions. So it's a high level of non-compliance. But there is actually a difference between the chemical products and the articles. So chemical products had a non-compliance of 95%, but this is because it's obvious and it can be seen on the web page directly. But for articles like toys and jewellery and so on, the non-compliance was 25%. And this is because we have to do chemical analysis before we can know that the product is non-compliant. And also because of this lower amount of non-compliance for articles, we could also see a difference between marketplaces and web shops, where marketplaces had a much higher degree of non-compliance, 45% compared to 18%. Safety data sheets were also checked, but only not the total content, but if it was available on the website and if it was in the correct language of the receiving member states. And that non-compliance was only 5%.
Okay, thank you. Sounds indeed like a high level of non-compliance. Maybe then if we move on to the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation, what was checked there and what did the inspectors find?
For chemical products here, like in the CEP regulation, the most typical non-compliance were the lack of hazard information in the online advertisement of a product. Because if you go to a physical store, you can see on the label how it is hazardous. But this is not possible in the online stores. So then this information has to be put on the website. And this was either missing totally or it was not clearly visible on the web page.
Okay, thank you. And what about then, last but not least, biocides? What were the findings there?
Yes, the inspectors were looking here for either non-approved biocides, that they are then illegal. And also here there are some special requirements for advertisement of biocides, and that was also checked like the ones in the CEP regulation. And overall, it was a 77% non-compliances for this part. The most non-compliant product types were repellents and attractants. And disinfectants were checked quite a lot during this pandemic period, and it has also quite a lot non-compliance, but not as high as the first ones. And also misleading advertisement were checked here because these products, the biocides, are designed to essentially kill living organisms. So then you cannot add advertisement like low risk biocidal product, non-toxic, harmless, and so on. And in 17% of the cases, this was non-compliant.
What kind of companies are we talking about? You mentioned marketplaces and web shops. What are the differences between them, and how many of them were not complying with the law?
I think not everyone are aware of this difference because, and we have defined web shops here in this project that the web shop own the product. They buy it and they sell it further on. And they can often be smaller web shops, but it could also be the big ones that already have physical stores, and they are responsible for their products. They sell them. But then we have the marketplaces, and they are just intermediates of products. They just offer them, but there are other sellers behind the offer. And the marketplaces are not responsible for the products. And I think most people are not really aware of this. And here we could see an overall difference in the non-compliance that was 95% for marketplaces and 65% for web shops.
Okay, makes sense that the marketplace where they're not responsible for the product, the non-compliance was larger. What about the repercussions? So what happened to the stores and the products, more importantly, that were not following the law? What actions were taken?
Yes, most of the time it's enough with written advice from the authorities, and most of the time the products and offers were then removed from the websites, or that the misleading information were corrected. So it was just in a few cases you had to go on with more harder measures for enforcement.
Let's move on then to you, Maciej. So thank you for joining us, first of all. What the main recommendations from the project were?
Thank you, Adam. Well, let's say the project has many recommendations for marketplaces, the industry, online sellers, also the consumers and the Commission. I will focus on the most important ones, and that is those for the European Commission and the sellers, online sellers and the marketplaces. And as Karin mentioned in her responses, the results of the project show that we have a fundamental issue of compliance with the EU legislation when it comes to products which are sold online. As you've seen the results, 3 out of 4 products were found to be in some way non-compliant, whether because there was lack of hazard information that was made available, or because they contained hazardous substances and were thus unsafe to the consumers. When we look at the rates of non-compliance, In this project and previous projects of the forum where inspectors checked restrictions duties, well, we can see that it's basically 4 times more non-compliance than shown through this more classical enforcement where inspectors check products by picking them from stores or doing border spot checks at the border with the customs. And considering that the volumes of online sales are only likely to grow, this problem is going to become more pressing in the future. So overall, I think we really need a shift in paradigm on how online sales are regulated in the European Union. And more responsibility needs to be put on the actors who are responsible for selling goods online, sellers and more particularly so online marketplaces, where, as Karin mentioned in her responses, the non-compliance rate was up to 95%. So considering all these reflections, the project basically puts forward 3 main recommendations to the European Commission. Firstly, to make marketplaces more responsible and liable for enforcement of illegal products, particularly those and control of the compliance of the products, particularly those from the sellers from outside of the EU. Secondly, to harmonize and strengthen the regulation of online commerce in the EU, and thirdly, to support and finance EU enforcement development IT tools to better scan the online offers.
Okay, thank you. Good. And then can you actually tell us what these recommendations mean in practice?
Well, for starters, the current legislation, when it applies to marketplaces who sell online, they are responsible to remove offers if they are informed, for example, by consumers or inspectors, that the offer is non-compliant. And to provide the information on the seller. This is the second obligation the marketplaces have. And these 2 obligations are really not enough, given the rate of non-compliance that we see. If they are only reactive to alerts by consumers or inspectors, then we see the rates of non-compliance that we do now. So the burden of responsibility for compliance of the online offers needs to really shift. And of course, marketplaces cannot really provide information on the properties of a given mixture, for example, but they certainly have the capability, and it should be mandatory for them to require the sellers of chemicals to provide all the necessary information. For example, for chemicals, this includes information on hazards, and also marketplaces could control whom the products are sold to. For example, some products should only be sold to trained professionals. In particular, when we saw it in biocides like rodenticides, they should not be really sold to consumers. And secondly, the marketplaces really are in a position to more proactively seek out non-compliance and not only rely on alerts from third parties. And they could do with this among all the offers that they publish. And this could be done via automated tools or even spot checks and occasionally a chemical analysis of suspicious products. And fully acknowledging that some marketplaces do this already on a voluntary basis, but as the results show, these voluntary efforts are not enough. And regarding the IT tools for enforcement, well, we know that the volumes of online sales are growing. There are millions of offers online every day, so inspectors really need more dedicated tools to screen many offers and make enforcement more efficient, so they're able to check more offers with these kind of tools.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the follow-ups are for this project. So that will hopefully bring some insight into how these tools, for example, can be implemented and what it requires. But what about then in the short term? What can be done before we have stronger regulation and better tools to regulate and monitor online sales? What can we do in the meantime?
Thanks. This is a really good question. Of course, any changes in regulation, they take time, so they could not be implemented immediately. So in the meantime, there's a number of things that particularly the online shops and marketplaces could do. For example, the marketplaces, or more of them, could join and sign the EU Product Safety Pledge.
Just to stop you for a moment there, what is that? What is the EU Product Safety Pledge?
This is essentially a voluntary agreement between some of the bigger marketplaces and the actors in the online sales. And in this pledge, these marketplaces essentially commit to improve voluntary detection of unsafe products. So they kind of do self-policing on their own volition.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Well, secondly, what the marketplaces could do is essentially request more information about sellers and their products, and this way they could also ensure that the offers that they publish satisfy the legal requirements before making them available online. So essentially, increase the requirements for publishing any given offer, particularly when it comes to chemicals. And as mentioned, I think the marketplace could also have a bit more proactive approach to finding non-compliant products before they are put on the market. And again, sellers and the individual sellers and the marketplaces could definitely become more familiar with the EU legislation when it comes to chemicals, particularly those regarding the provision of information in the online offers. And ideally, this should happen before any offers are put online. With regard to industry and trade associations, we've seen that let's say the level of awareness of the requirements for the legal duties is maybe has room for improvement. So it would definitely be beneficial if industry and trade associations could engage into a bit more awareness raising campaigns amongst the companies about the requirements of REACH, CLP, and the biocides product regulation, and in particular about the information that must be published with the online sales in the online offers.
Let's move on to what companies can do to make sure that the products that they're buying actually meet the legal requirements. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, if you ask about the companies, then certainly they would be expected to be buying for commercial purposes. So I think the commercial buyers could clearly set rather strict or clear demands on the suppliers, so that the suppliers demonstrate that the products they sell, for example, mixtures, whether it be for industrial use, they comply with the EU law. This could, for example, be correct classification labeling. And when it comes to articles, then the suppliers should be able to demonstrate compliance with restrictions duties. And companies could even consider requesting compliance certificates that the articles have been analyzed and are free of restricted hazardous substances.
Now, as a consumer, also listening to what you said before, that there are products that potentially shouldn't even be sold to consumers. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, should I be worried as a consumer when buying these products online?
Well, maybe not worried, but certainly aware there are certain risks. So the answer to your question is yes and no, both. In fact, we know there is a high level of non-compliance, as Karin has mentioned earlier and described in detail. But it is important to note, of course, that the results of the project are not a survey of the market, but more targeted controls. So consumers, well, basically, they should be aware that there might be some risks involved. And of course, the common problem for the consumer is that often there's just no information on the hazards that's provided in the offer, and so consumers cannot know that the products that they buy, particularly articles, may contain hazardous substances. So let's say a good general advice is that consumers are best should avoid buying products where there's either incomplete or there's no information on the seller. And this should really, flash up the red light for the consumers. And whenever the consumers have doubt, for example, if there's no information on contents, on the safe use of the product, then it's best to contact the seller and request the information on such product. In particular, if consumers would be buying mixtures, it's always a good idea to check the safety label and look for information on hazards and safe use. When buying articles, it's a good idea to ask the seller whether the goods contain any hazardous substances and see what they respond. And in particular, if the consumers buy chemicals from outside of the EU, well, then they are importing them into the EU. And in such situations, they may even be responsible for compliance with some of the duties, such as specification or notification to ECHA. It's therefore a good idea to generally buy chemicals from sellers who you know are established in the European Union.
Okay, thank you. Especially the point about you becoming an importer suddenly if you buy from outside the EU. That's a surprise to me as a consumer, and I think it's something that definitely should drive people to maybe buy more, let's say, locally in the EU then. Good advice for our listeners there. So next question, just to be clear, who's ultimately the one who is responsible if they sell me a product that can potentially be harmful without appropriate safety information? And if this happens to me, how can I report them?
In the current legislation, the answer is clear, and it's the seller who's responsible. The problem, of course, is that if the seller is based outside of the European Union, then enforcement authorities have little ability to enforce that they comply with the legislation. And therefore, in this situation, it's the marketplace that offers to delete these offers from non-EU sellers that are non-compliant voluntarily. And in case the sellers are located outside of the EU, normally enforcement authorities approach the marketplace through which this incompliant offer is made. And if their offer does not contain, for example, if the offer does not contain the required information or is otherwise not compliant, and then the marketplace is obliged to remove this offer. So marketplaces kind of act responsively to indications of non-compliance. But if the marketplaces are themselves outside of the EU, then the inspectors will still ask that non-EU marketplace to take down the offer, and may even approach the enforcement authorities of the country where the seller is located. As far as consumers are concerned, then whenever they see that there is a non-compliant offer, a good idea is to report all cases where consumers suspect non-compliance. And the fastest way to do it is to report them directly to the marketplace where they find the offer. And most of these marketplaces have their own channels and instructions how to report illegal offers.
Now, we talked about the recommendations. What about then the next steps on the practical implementation? So now that the report's been published, how will all these recommendations be monitored and followed up?
Well, for starters, together with the forum working group, we'll be organizing a workshop with stakeholder organizations, and the aim is to do it sometime in the first half of next year, to communicate and discuss the findings and also discuss the recommendations. And we hope, of course, that the stakeholder organizations, both industry and consumers, will take up these project recommendations and organize, for example, awareness-raising campaigns. And this applies both to the industry and also to the consumers, so that they are aware that certain risks are involved when buying chemicals online. As regards recommendations to the European Commission, well, we hope, of course, the recommendations will be considered in the ongoing development of the EU law that regulates online sales. And as for enforcement, the forum will continue to support further controls of online sales. It is recommended in the project, control of online sales will really become a regular component of future enforcement projects. So we'll likely come back to this topic in the future.
And I'm sure many of our listeners will also be following it with interest. Now we've come to the end of our episode, so thank you very much, Karin, for sharing your insights into the results, and Maciej for going through the main recommendations and the next steps. For our listeners, you can read the full report on our website. The best way to stay up to date on the follow-up of this report and to find out about other ongoing or planned enforcement projects is to subscribe to our weekly news at echa.europa.eu/subscribe. Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.